Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, Professor of Geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're very fortunate to have Maria Fadiman, Associate Professor of Geography at Florida Atlantic University. Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Well, we often like to hear about how individuals in geography reflect upon their lives and how they really became involved in geography, especially perhaps from childhood. Is there anything from childhood that inspired you to look at all the world and everything in it?
Well, when I was younger, I always wanted to be out in the trees and out in nature. And I was lucky I went to an alternative school where you would learn how to read and write and do those kinds of things, but we also had tree houses and ways to just be in the world that were outside of the box, I think the way we often think about that. So to me, that was my world. I didn't know that was so different. And then I also used to go to a summer camp where we would sleep in the trees. Our beds hung between redwood trees. It was in Northern California, and you would climb up your little ladder to get into your bed, and you would climb in, and you would be in the natural world that way. And I loved that, and I knew I wanted to be a part of that. And once I started going to school, more formal school, like college, I wanted to save the world and save the trees. However, I didn't want to do science. So I figured just whatever that was about, I wasn't doing it. So I was going to be an English major. And because I love to read, and I figured that was what would work for me. And so then when I was in college, I was trying to be an English major, but they didn't have enough English classes because a lot of people want to be English majors. So I was like, well...
Was this at Vassar?
This was at Vassar.
And everybody wanted to be an English major?
Not everybody, but a whole lot of Vassar people are English major kinds of people. So I was already interested in Latin America. Growing up in California, so many people spoke Spanish, and we were right on the border with Mexico. So that was already of interest to me. And I thought, well, I'll do Latin American studies, because then I can do Latin American literature within that. And I'll still read the books, just it'll be in Spanish. I was like, okay. And while I was there at Vassar, we didn't have requirements. So I could go through my whole college career without taking math or science. And I thought that was terrific. And my advisor said, this is really imbalanced, what you've chosen to do, is you don't have any math or science. He said, I can't advise you if that's what you're going to choose. And I thought, oof, good point. So I switched advisors. I want to do it. So I was going through that and still veering away from that. And I didn't, geography, I actually have to be honest, I took one geography class. I've dropped one class in all of my college career. You take it, and you're like, oh, not quite my fit. It was a geography class.
Really?
I was like,
at Vassar. Who was it with?
Godfrey. Brian Godfrey was a great professor and a big deal. And I was like,
Who needs geography?
I was like, I'm going to go read books. So I still had this feeling, though, of I really wanted to work with the natural world, even though I was afraid to learn about it. So I graduated from Vassar, and I was like, woo, I'm done with school forever. Yay! And then I started doing volunteer work, and a lot of that took place in the forests, and I was kind of trying to make up what I was doing out there, trying to work with people and plants. And eventually I thought, maybe I do want to learn how to work with the ecosystem and the people in it. And I was like, so I was like, I'll go back to graduate school. And I was going to do anthropology, because I thought, well, that's people, that works for me. And I missed the anthropology deadline. So I was like, so Latin American studies was still available. So I said, all right, well, I'll do that. And within that, though, I started to do anthropology and botany. And I began to combine people and plants. I kind of sucked it up and started to do some of the science. And I was like, this is great. This is really interesting, too. So that's kind of how I got into then what I wanted to do was people and plants, and I learned about ethnobotany, people and plants. And then I graduated from my master's from Tulane, and I was like, woohoo, I'm done forever. And then I did some more volunteer work, and then I thought, okay, I want to know how to do this, and I want to go with a different kind of focus. So I thought, oh, it's the PhD. So I called a botany professor at the University of Texas at Austin. There's a famous ethnobotanist, Beryl Simpson. And I said, hi, ethnobotany, and I'm into it. And she said, well, you don't sound like a botanist. I was like, oh, I'm not a botanist. I really want to do ethnobotany. And she said, why don't you talk to geography? I was like, geography?
I dropped that class a long time ago, huh?
What's geography? Is that even a real department? I was like, ah. And so I called the geography department, and they said, we work with land and people and all of these things that I suddenly thought, oh my gosh, this is it. So I applied to the geography department. So it was I'd never taken a geography class until I started my PhD, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is home. What a place for me to want to combine those things and have it be in a department where I'm not trying to finagle anything. This is really one of the things that they do. So that is how I squirmed my way towards
That's how you got to
geography.
geography. Well,
Yeah.
well, let's talk a little bit about your early experiences in the PhD program at Texas. I mean, you really had a dynamite faculty.
Yes.
I mean, Terry Jordan, Bill Doolittle, Carl Butzer.
Yeah.
And others. Comment on their influences, perhaps.
So when I arrived in Texas, I was very clear that I wanted to do ethnobotany. I had it sorted, and I was going to do it within this discipline of geography because they were really open to it and excited. And when I first met, I was meeting with Dr. Doolittle, and I would later take classes with Butzer, and Terry Jordan was great, and also Greg Knapp, who works in Ecuador. And so I was going to interview. I'd applied, but I hadn't yet been accepted. And I was actually talking with one of them, and they were saying, well, what's your goals? Do you want to be a professor? I was like, oof. It just hadn't occurred to me. Who would want to be a professor? I said, well, no, I want to work for an NGO, and I'm going to save the world. He was like, all right, well, do you want to indicate you might like to be a professor as part of that? And I was like, okay, I'll say that. So my application, I was like, I want to save the world, work for an NGO, and I'll be a professor too. And then through being there, and once I started to be a TA, and I started to teach, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's more than one way to save the world, and what an opportunity to get to do this. So through being there, I then realized, wow, I would love to be a professor, which was not my goal coming in. And they were very open with me. They were willing to support me in what I wanted to do. I mean, when I first met Dr. Doolittle, I was outside his office, and I was meeting my advisor for the first time, and I was like, oh, okay, And then I knock on the door, and he's like, come in. And I walk in, and he's got his Texas boots on and his jeans, and he's got his Western shirt, and he's got his feet up on the desk, and he's like, come on in and have a seat. And I was like, oh, they're cool here. Okay. And he took me around the campus, and we just started to talk about ideas and starting to break me loose a little bit also from it had to be exactly what I came in thinking I was going to do. It was ethnobotany, and that was my parameters. And through people supporting me, they also helped me open my eyes to other ways of looking at the world that wasn't such a limited focus, that I really had seen geography as the avenue through which I could do what I wanted to do. And through being there, I began to see that actually geography opened up new ways for me to add to what I wanted to do and gave it a much broader perspective. So it really was pretty meaningful for me to be there and their influence and their support.
This matter of support is so very important, and I've met Bill Doolittle on occasion, and I've gotten the impression that he's always been very, very supportive of his students. He must have a reputation for that, really.
He's great. When I came in, because he works mostly in the desert in Sonora. Now he works all
Everywhere,
over. But he said, so do you want to, how about working in the desert? And I was like, I want to work in the rainforest. And he showed me some chart of really studied places and understudied places. And the desert, there's a lot more work to be done in the desert. And I looked at the chart, and I said, okay, I still want to work in the rainforest. And he said, okay. And then he supported me 100% to do what I wanted to do, even though that wasn't necessarily his first inclination of what he does. And he came out to visit me out there. And at the time, because Texas is famous for muddy boots research.
Sure.
It was when I was there. And I loved that. I was like, and it's proving you're tough, and you go out there. And I was like, yeah, this is it. So my study site in Ecuador was, you landed in Quito, and then you would take a bus for about 6 hours to this other town, Quinandé, and from there, then you get this whatever kind of car was going, and you all hang on and you squash in, and then it's about a 13-kilometer hike into the station. And this was all a big adventure, and it was hard, and Dr. Doolittle was coming out to visit me. And I was like, I'm gonna show him how hard my research is, and he's gonna think I'm really cool. But I totally had lost perspective at that point from having been out there so long and having done this. So he comes in the midnight flight from Austin, Texas. I put him in a hotel, and 5 hours later, I'm knocking on his door. I'm like, all right, let's go. We're getting on the bus. So he's had this much sleep, and we get on the bus, and then we get on the little transport thing, and he's hanging on, and he's doing it, and we're now at this little, it's kind of a town. It has a few little people will sell you some rice and beans, and I have gotten arranged for horses or burros, depending on what shows up, to bring us in for that last stretch. And they didn't show up. And I was like, we'll just walk in. And he said, okay, we'll do that. And so he's been traveling for so long by now. And
It's a very circuitous route.
I have walked this so many times. And I've gotten him a big pair of rubber boots, because I was like, you cannot wear your ropers. You cannot wear your Texas boots out here because there's mud. He's like, all right. So he's in these rubber boots that he's never worn before. So we start walking, and it is so hot, and it's muddy. And he is such a trooper, and we're going, and he spent time in Vietnam, and he's never talked about that before. And for the first time, he started talking about that a little bit. And then I'm like, we're almost there. I mean, we're not almost there at all. And I'm suddenly realizing, oh my gosh, we're out in the middle of this dirt road, and my advisor, who's super tough, is about to melt. And we have to get there before dark. There's poisonous snakes. There's all of these things. And I have gotten us into this. I'm like, oh. So we make it. And he has walked the whole way. And then I say, okay, now we're going to go where we shower, which is in a waterfall. And that's so cool. And he's looking at me going, okay. And the waterfall is down all these little palm dirt steps. And when you get down there, it's all kind of mossy. And I'm like, don't slip. And he's like, I won't slip. And he sat there, we shower, we come back. I later learned that while we were out there, he'd gotten 2 huge blisters on the bottoms of his feet. He ended up losing 3 toenails by the time he got back, but he didn't say a word of that to me. So he was a trooper. And
what you've just shared is so indicative of his character and why he has such a stellar reputation as a solid supporter of his students and a good man in the field, a good field geographer.
Yeah.
Certainly an admirable and stellar geographer.
Yeah, and he really taught me also in the field. You ask the questions that you're intending to ask. You pursue what you're planning to pursue. And then you also see what else is happening around you. And that was huge, because actually, initially my dissertation site was going to be somewhere else. It was going to be in the Amazon in Ecuador. And before I went, they had kidnapped oil workers, and there'd been some deaths, and I couldn't go to that area. And I'd gotten my funding, my proposal, I was ABD, I was like, And he said, what are you gonna do? I said, well, I'm still gonna go out there and figure it out. And he said, good, all right. So I was already so I went out there, and I did not have the same people I'd been researching. I did not have the same plants I'd been researching. Nothing was the same. But he'd helped teach me, as did also Francisco Perez, who's a ecologist, botanist out there, and Knapp, and all of them, to go with what was happening, and since it had all fallen apart, work with what I knew to create a new and different project. And I was able to do that, and really their help in, again, helping me see what's happening beyond what I thought was happening is something I carry through with me now in all my projects.
It's certainly very important. It's not a very comfortable task, I think, for those accustomed with filling in rubrics, is it? We could go on and on about that, but I don't care to, because this essentially highlights in many ways how holistic our discipline is, and how wonderful it can be going out in the field and seeing what you see, learning through observation, what makes a little part of the world tick. It's beautiful.
I mean, it really is. It was, even for my comprehensive exams, and part of them was going to be in Latin America, and Dr. Doolittle said, well, how about we'll have it be Latin America in general? And I said, oh, I just want to do the rainforests in Latin America. He said, well, maybe one day you'll teach a class on Latin America, and it won't just be that. I was like, I'm not going to learn about the urban stuff. I don't care about any of that. And he wouldn't have that. So I learned all these things. And of course, now I do teach a class on Latin America. And I love the urban stuff that's not what I study, and it's not how I think. And I learn about it, and then I get to teach about it, and now I walk through a city differently. And it has just changed how I do so many things, with that whole thing of observe, see what you're seeing, incorporate it if you can. If not, you just learn something. Goodness forbid, just other than what you were doing. So, yeah, absolutely. Which is when I began, I think, to become more of a geographer. I began to embrace that, and also the other students with whom I was working when I was a TA, and doing kind of a cultural geography, and it was all sorts of things that I didn't know about, and I thought maybe I didn't care about. And through some of their research, which was so different from mine, it was, reading the landscape in a different way, and looking when someone was studying sports and somebody was studying ethnicity, and bringing that in, and then teaching that as a TA, looking at it differently. I thought, oh my gosh, the rest of you guys are doing really cool things. Let me incorporate some of that and learn from you. So that was also a really great dynamic in graduate school, was really learning from each other about things that I just hadn't heard of before.
Well, engaging in the interpretation of landscapes is just a wonderful pursuit that geographers engage in. You commented on graduate students helping you understand these things. Any graduate students at Texas that really helped you understand much about landscapes as your mentors and professors did?
It's interesting. Chris Gaffney, who was, he was actually the one I mentioned with sports. He wrote a book about stadiums, and he was interpreting, I'm going to get this wrong, but this is what it sounded like to me, looking at social phenomena that are happening and playing out on sports fields and with fans and all of the dynamics that go with that. And I just thought, what? That's not real. And that can't be academic. And through his explaining to me absolutely how it manifests on the landscape and what it means and how important it is to people, and to address that and analyze it, it just opened my eyes to, oh my gosh, what a different way to look at the world around us. And he really helped influence me in how I teach. And also Amy Mills, who I spent time with her and doing her research. She was researching in Turkey at the time. And she has written a book on landscape, and she was looking at ethnicity and neighborhoods and how they develop. And I was visiting her because she was in Turkey. And I was like, oh, I've never been there. And it was going into people's homes and having tea with them, and them talking about their situation and looking at what they served on their table for food, and how that would be different when we would go into a different ethnicity and that kind of person. And again, these were things I had never paid attention to or thought of in an academic way. And then it's so interesting. And I teach a class now on food and culture and the environment, and what that means to people, and how that interacts with who people are and what is important to them in the landscape and sustainability and all these different aspects. So it just really broadened my world, and now I have so much more fun within geography.
So I guess it's fair to say that through these encounters, you really learned in many ways how the landscape is perceived through others' eyes, and how the landscape is not necessarily what is material, but also what is non-material
Yeah.
through your interactions and dialogues with someone while you're engaging in a nice cup of tea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's wonderful. One thing about Bill Doolittle, and it just occurred to me. Did he ever comment on the influence of his own advisor at Oklahoma?
Ah, yes, and actually he came to University of Texas at Austin, and we all had an opportunity to meet with him and talk with him. And it's very much, I would say, Bill Doolittle in many ways learned so much from him. He didn't say, "Oh, my mentor told me this," but after you get to know him and see his way of researching, you see so many of the things that Doolittle does, and then you see so many of the things that so many of us as his students do as well, in a way of just getting out there and being.
Well, if I reflect upon the type of research that was done among the students in your generation at Texas, and then among many of the faculty, I guess it could be classified as cultural ecology.
Yeah, yeah.
And Turner was indeed a stellar cultural ecologist. Still is. I
Yeah,
shouldn't say
yeah,
was.
yeah.
I mean, I recall listening to him speak at, I think it was an AAG meeting in Phoenix, maybe, where he delivered an address on cultural geography. It was very, very insightful in many, many ways. You know? So now you really devote most of your research to ethnobotany, and you're in Latin America as well as in Africa.
Yes, well, it was Latin American Studies at Vassar as a way to read books, and then it was Latin American Studies at Tulane as a way to get in there and do my ethnobotany. So I felt like everything, and then Texas at the time was very focused on Latin American Studies, so that worked perfectly for me. And it was actually when I started to teach, and I was teaching world geography, and I had this great lecture on Latin America, and then I would read the textbook for all the other countries, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's a whole world out there. There's all of these places that are exciting. So it really was a shift for me to go beyond Latin America. So then Africa, I mean, that just felt so exotic and so far away, and I had an opportunity to go. And the first time I was going to Africa, I was on the airplane, and the woman next to me sat down, and we took off, and then she went to the bathroom, and she came back in her pajamas. I was like, "Whoa." She's like, "It's my 6th time to Africa. It's a long flight." I was like, "Oh, okay." She said, "Oh, are you working in Africa?" I said, "Just this one trip. I work in Latin America." And she said, "Oh, there's something about Africa that gets under your skin," which you would understand. And I thought, okay, that's fine, but really, I work somewhere else. So now I've been, back to Africa 7 times, and I've been working there on and off for the last 10 years. So that's become a huge part of my research. And I also began to take advantage of any opportunity that came my way to work somewhere new. I had a friend who was working in the State Department in the Philippines. I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna come do a project." I do a lot of work with palm trees. I'm like, there are palm trees there. So doing a project there, or I had an opportunity to go to New Zealand, and just trying to really, I find the world now extra fascinating.
Through palm trees.
Well, it's often through palm trees, but sometimes I was just more recently in Shanghai looking at urban area, not my thing, but I went to the parks, and I was looking at what people are doing in park green spaces and urban green spaces, which was new for me and in a different way. And again, that comes completely through geography, but that's also ethnobotany. That's people interacting with plants. So,
Well, we certainly have a strong ethnobotanical tradition in geography. I mean, Anderson, Sauer, and Johannesson, others.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
they're Parsons. My goodness, the list goes on and on and on. We really do devote a lot of time to this matter of plants and people. You know? Are would you characterize your research in terms of plants in any particular way? It seems to me you've really looked at how people of different ethnicities may use the same kind of plant for jewelry or hats or garments or different ways in which they use them in the environment. Is this your focus in terms of the material aspects of the way in which plants are used?
Yeah, very much. When I first was doing ethnobotany, it was medicinal plants, because that's what you think of, and medicine man, and that's the sexiest, and it is very interesting and important. And at one point, I was working with a healer, a curandero in Ecuador, and we were going out, and I had a sore throat that day, and I thought, hoo-hoo, here I was like, got a sore throat. And he said, oh, well, why don't you take 2 aspirin, and then we'll go. And I was like, what? So, not that was the shifting point, but I realized, this is very important, and I also want to study things where I see it happening, and they're using it, and I can touch it and do the result of what the plant is useful for, and then I started looking at more physical material culture in that way. And it was also when I was doing my master's, when I was at Tulane, and my advisor at the time was a botanist, Dr. Darwin, and he said, well, how about palm trees? And I was like, why palm trees? He said, well, because you don't know botany all that well, and you'll be able to recognize them. I thought, perfect reason, okay.
Bada bing, bada boom, palm trees it is.
Exactly. And then, of course, I learned palm trees are so useful, and they're all over the world, and they're these amazing plants. So it really was starting to be looking at how they're using that. And my larger goal with all of this is conservation and sustainability. So I really look at, are people using plants in a way that's sustainable? And if not, where do we go from there? And if they are, how do we help bring to light that realization also for themselves in terms of, if I can collect from a palm tree sustainably, which sometimes you take the fronds and it's sustainable, sometimes you cut the whole tree down. It's not really a tree, but the stem, that's not sustainable. So also looking at what are they doing and not doing that makes it functional for them, and how does that relate to larger concepts of conservation? In some areas where they were using a plant, that plant was so important to them and it could only grow in the intact forest. So they were actually saving that piece of the forest so they could have that plant grow and be able to use that plant. And that to me was one of the largest messages that struck me, was if we can do whole forest conservation through people's internal desire. I wasn't coming from the outside and saying, this is what you guys should do. We already cut our forests down, but it was saying, you're already doing this. Let's work with, from your angle and your conservation incentives, and see how that can lead to a more win-win situation.
So essentially, you're employing a strategy that addresses ethnobotanical behavior.
Yeah, really looking at how people use plants. Partly what they use them for. Mm-hmm. It's super interesting with a palm tree that you can weave a basket, and that you can take the seeds and cut and make rings out of those, and then you can sell those rings. And if you can make $1 for a ring, or if the loggers are going to give you $1 for a tree, what are some other decisions that you could make in terms of your economic well-being? Or with a basket, you could sell the basket, or through making this basket, you don't have to buy a basket. You don't have to bring that plastic into your home, which, if they want to, I am not there to say that one should not do that. And then you throw the basket over the edge, and then you've got all the garbage, and it just changes the whole dynamic. Whereas using these plants and seeing how they're incorporated into people's lives and culture, both the use and the collection, hopefully makes for a more integrated way of looking at conservation that isn't doing conservation for conservation's sake. It's saying we're doing this because that's most useful. That's the agenda. And the trees get saved. Double bonus.
There we go. We only have a couple of moments left, and I'd like to ask you, if you reflect on the path that you've trod, and you see your students today, and you look at other professors, other geographers, do you have any pearls of wisdom, any advice for prospective geographers, for students that are really interested in pursuing geography?
I would say to just keep your eyes open to what you're interested in and what comes along the way that's not what you thought it was going to be. And I also would say follow what interests you most. I mean, to do a lot of these things, I would waitress over the summer and then I would go do a volunteer opportunity in the rainforest. And that was how I started to even know that's the direction I wanted to pursue. So I would say go with what your heart tells you. And within geography, there's probably going to be some way to turn it into an academic endeavor because it is very embracing. So I would say pursue what you want to pursue and be looking around for the other things that might add a depth to your project and your interests.
Maria, thank you so very much for joining us. You're delivering this Visiting Geographical Scientist lecture this evening, and we very much look forward to seeing you perform once again.
Well, thank you. This was fun. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. This concludes our session of Conversation with the Geographer.